In the quiet, tree-lined streets of Willow Creek Estates, Mark Thompson lived a simple yet content life. He was the kind of neighbor everyone liked, polite, friendly, and always willing to lend a hand. His house was the picture of neatness, with perfectly trimmed hedges, a freshly painted front door, and flower beds that bloomed in vibrant colors all year round. If there was ever an award for best neighbor, Mark would have been a strong contender. But what truly set Mark apart wasn't just his charm or his tidy home, it was his passion for motorcycles. Specifically, one motorcycle, a gleaming red 1972 Yamaha XS650 he affectionately called Ruby. Ruby wasn't just any old bike. She was a masterpiece, restored piece by painstaking piece over countless weekends. Every nut, bolt, and chrome detail had been lovingly polished until she shone like new. To Mark, Ruby represented more than just transportation. She symbolized freedom, nostalgia, and years of hard work. At $6,000, Ruby might not have been the most expensive vintage motorcycle out there, but to Mark, she was priceless. Willow Creek Estates, however, wasn't your typical suburban neighborhood. It was governed by a strict homeowners association, HOA, whose members took their rulebook very seriously. The HOA enforced guidelines about everything from mailbox colors to lawn ornaments, ensuring that the community maintained its pristine appearance. While some residents found these rules annoying, Mark didn't mind them too much. After all, he believed in keeping things orderly. Besides, he figured that following the rules kept the peace, and he valued peace above almost anything else. That is, until Karen Miller moved in next door. Karen arrived on a crisp autumn morning, her moving truck blocking half the street while workers unloaded boxes and furniture. From the start, she made it clear that she intended to leave her mark on Willow Creek Estates. Within days of settling in, Karen began introducing herself to neighbors, not with warm smiles or friendly chats, but with pointed observations about their properties. Her first visit to Mark's house ended with her frowning at Ruby, which sat proudly in the driveway under a protective cover. "That thing doesn't exactly scream suburban charm," Karen said bluntly, tapping her foot as if waiting for Mark to apologize. But Mark simply smiled and explained how much the motorcycle meant to him. He assured her that Ruby stayed covered when not in use, and promised she wouldn't cause any trouble. For a moment, it seemed like Karen accepted his explanation. Little did Mark know this encounter planted the seed for what would become months of tension. As weeks turned into months, Karen quickly earned herself a reputation among the residents. Behind closed doors, people referred to her as HOA Karen, a nickname born out of her relentless crusade to enforce every minor regulation in the HOA handbook. Whether it was complaining about holiday decorations staying up past January 15th, or issuing warnings to dog owners whose pets lingered too long near shared walkways, Karen made sure everyone knew she meant business. Some neighbors tried to humor her, rolling their eyes good-naturedly whenever she marched through the cul-de-sac wielding her clipboard. Others avoided her altogether, ducking behind curtains when they saw her car pull up outside. Mark, however, preferred to stay neutral. He figured that ignoring Karen's antics was the best way to keep the peace. After all, Ruby posed no real threat to anyone. She sat quietly in the driveway, tucked safely beneath her cover, never making noise or causing disturbances. Surely, Karen would eventually tire of nitpicking and focus her attention elsewhere, or so he hoped. What Mark failed to realize was that Karen thrived on conflict. To her, enforcing the HOA rules wasn't just about maintaining appearances. It was about control. And Ruby, with its bold curves and undeniable presence, represented something Karen couldn't abide: individuality. In her eyes, conformity equaled perfection, and anything that deviated from the norm needed to be corrected or eliminated. So, while Mark went about his daily routine, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing on the horizon, Karen began plotting her next move. She studied the HOA handbook late into the night, searching for loopholes and technicalities she could exploit. She snapped photos of Ruby from various angles, documenting every inch of its existence as evidence. And she attended board meetings armed with charts, graphs, and lengthy speeches designed to sway opinions in her favor. To Karen, this wasn't personal. It was principle. But to Mark, it would soon feel deeply personal indeed. Because sometimes, even the smallest disagreements can spiral into battles neither side sees coming. And in Willow Creek Estates, where harmony once reigned supreme, the stage was now set for a clash between tradition and independence, order and passion, rules and rebellion. Little did Mark know, his cherished Ruby, and perhaps even his entire way of life, was about to face its greatest challenge yet. One sunny afternoon, Mark returned home after a long day at work. The spring air carried the faint scent of blooming flowers, and the neighborhood was alive with the sounds of birds chirping and children playing. It had been a good day, until he spotted something unusual taped to his front door. A white envelope stood out against the warm wood of his entrance, its edges slightly curled from the breeze. Mark's heart sank as he recognized the official HOA logo printed in bold letters. Across the top, he tore open the envelope, his fingers trembling slightly as he unfolded the letter inside. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Violation notice. According to the document, Karen Miller, acting as interim president of the HOA board, had filed a complaint about Ruby, the vintage motorcycle that sat proudly under its weatherproof cover in Mark's driveway. The offense? Improper storage of personal property. Apparently, Ruby didn't meet the HOA's standards for aesthetically pleasing items allowed in visible areas of residents' properties. Mark read the letter twice, then 3 times, trying to make sense of it. He felt a mix of disbelief and frustration bubbling up inside him. How could someone consider Ruby, an impeccably restored piece of machinery, a violation? She wasn't just some rusty old bike collecting dust. She was a work of art, a testament to craftsmanship and dedication. And besides, Ruby wasn't even cluttering the space. She stayed neatly tucked away under her protective cover, out of sight unless Mark decided to take her for a ride. Still reeling from the shock, Mark decided to attend the next HOA meeting to address the issue directly. He figured that if he explained the situation calmly and reasonably, Karen would see things from his perspective. Maybe she hadn't realized how much Ruby meant to him or misunderstood the rules herself. Armed with photos of Ruby's restoration process and a copy of the HOA guidelines, Mark walked into the community center ready to present his case. The meeting room buzzed with chatter as residents took their seats around a large wooden table. Mark spotted Karen immediately. She sat at the head of the table, her posture rigid and her expression stern. Her clipboard rested on the table in front of her, and she tapped her pen impatiently as others discussed mundane topics like upcoming landscaping projects and holiday decorations. When it was finally time to bring up violations, Karen wasted no time turning the conversation toward Ruby. "Let's talk about Section 4.2 of our guidelines," Karen announced, her voice carrying an air of authority. "It clearly states that driveways are intended for vehicles deemed decorative and complementary to the overall aesthetic of Willow Creek Estates. Unfortunately, motorcycles do not fall under this category." Mark raised his hand politely, waiting for Karen to acknowledge him before speaking. "I understand where you're coming from," he began, choosing his words carefully. "But Ruby isn't just any motorcycle. She's a vintage model, fully restored, and holds significant sentimental value to me. Plus, she stays covered when not in use, so she doesn't detract from the neighborhood's appearance." Karen listened without blinking, her lips pressed into a thin line. When Mark finished, she responded coolly. "Sentimental value aside, the rules are the rules. We have to maintain consistency across the board. Allowing exceptions sets a dangerous precedent." Determined to find common ground, Mark offered a compromise. "What if I store Ruby in my garage instead of the driveway? That way she won't be visible at all." Karen hesitated for a moment, glancing down at her notes as though considering the suggestion. But then, shaking her head firmly, she replied, "That's not enough. The violation has already been documented. You'll need to remove the motorcycle entirely within 30 days, or face further consequences." The room fell silent. Mark felt his cheeks flush with anger and embarrassment. He glanced around at the other board members, hoping for support, but most avoided eye contact. It was clear that Karen held the reins here, and no one dared challenge her. As the meeting adjourned, Mark lingered behind, hoping to speak with Karen privately. But she brushed past him, muttering something about having another appointment. Left standing alone in the empty room, Mark clenched his fists and exhaled sharply. He couldn't believe what had just happened. What started as a minor disagreement over aesthetics had escalated into a full-blown ultimatum. 30 days to get rid of Ruby, or else. Over the next few weeks, Mark tried everything he could think of to resolve the situation peacefully. He reached out to other neighbors, asking if they'd be willing to sign a petition supporting his right to keep Ruby. Most were sympathetic but hesitant to cross Karen. "She's relentless," one neighbor warned. "If you push back too hard, she'll only dig in deeper." Mark also revisited the HOA guidelines, poring over every page in search of loopholes or ambiguities he might exploit. While the language about decorative vehicles seemed vague, Karen's interpretation appeared ironclad. Without concrete evidence to refute her claims, Mark knew arguing further would likely prove futile. Despite the mounting pressure, Mark refused to give up hope. He continued caring for Ruby, taking her for occasional rides to clear his mind and remind himself why he loved her so much. Each ride reinforced his determination to fight for justice, not just for himself, but for anyone else who might fall victim to Karen's overzealous enforcement tactics. But as the deadline loomed closer, doubt began creeping in. Would Karen really follow through on her threat? Could she actually force him to part with Ruby? These questions haunted Mark day and night, casting a shadow over his usually peaceful existence. Little did he know, Karen was far more ruthless than he imagined, and her actions would soon leave him devastated. For now, though, Mark clung to the belief that reason and fairness would prevail. Surely the HOA wouldn't allow such a drastic measure to occur. Surely someone would step in before it was too late. Yet deep down, a nagging voice whispered that Karen wasn't the type to back down easily. And as the clock ticked closer to the 30-day mark, Mark braced himself for whatever came next. The 30-day deadline came and went, and Mark breathed a cautious sigh of relief. Days turned into a week and nothing seemed amiss. Ruby still sat quietly under her protective cover in the driveway, untouched and undisturbed. Maybe Karen had decided to let the matter drop, he thought. Perhaps cooler heads had prevailed after all. But deep down, a nagging voice whispered that things were far too quiet. And with Karen involved, silence rarely meant peace. One Saturday morning, Mark woke up, early, eager to take Ruby for a ride. The weather was perfect, crisp air, clear skies, and just enough sunshine to make the roads glisten. He grabbed his helmet, slipped on his leather jacket, and headed outside, already imagining the wind rushing past him as Ruby roared to life. But when he stepped onto the driveway, his heart stopped. Ruby was gone. At first, Mark thought maybe he'd parked her somewhere else by mistake. He scanned the yard, checked the garage, even peeked behind the bushes. Panic began to creep in as the realization hit him. Ruby wasn't there. His eyes darted around frantically until they landed on a folded piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper of his car. With trembling hands, he unfolded it and read the note scrawled in bold handwriting. Towed per HOA directive. Contact Management Office. Mark's stomach churned as anger and disbelief washed over him. How could this happen? He rushed inside, grabbed his phone, and called the HOA Management Office. The receptionist confirmed what he feared most. Ruby had been towed away, and worse, sold at a public auction. According to the woman on the other end of the line, Karen herself had authorized the action, claiming it was necessary to enforce compliance with the HOA guidelines. Sold? Mark stammered, his voice rising. You can't just sell someone's property without their permission. I'm sorry, sir, the receptionist replied curtly. The decision was made according to the rules. You'll need to speak directly with Mrs. Miller if you have concerns. Fuming, Mark hung up and immediately drove to Karen's house. His knuckles rapped sharply against her front door, each knock fueled by mounting frustration. When Karen finally answered, she looked unsurprised to see him, her lips curling into a smug smile. What did you do with my motorcycle? Mark demanded, struggling to keep his voice steady. Karen crossed her arms and leaned casually against the doorway. "I did what needed to be done," she said coolly. "You ignored the violation notice and failed to comply with the HOA regulations. As interim president, I took appropriate action." "Appropriate action," Mark repeated incredulously. "You stole my bike. Do you realize how much time and money I put into restoring that motorcycle? It's irreplaceable." Karen shrugged, unfazed by his outrage. "Irreplaceable or not, it violated community standards, and now it's out of our neighborhood for good. End of story." Her casual dismissal left Mark speechless. He stood there, fists clenched, as Karen turned and walked back into her house without another word. Slamming the door shut behind her, she effectively ended the conversation. But not before delivering one final blow. Through the closed door, her muffled voice echoed, "Good luck finding it." As Mark drove home, his mind raced with questions. Where had Ruby been taken? Who had bought her? Could he possibly track her down and get her back? The thought of never seeing her again felt unbearable. Ruby wasn't just a possession. She was a part of him. Losing her felt like losing a piece of his soul. Determined to uncover the truth, Mark returned to the HOA management office later that day. This time, he demanded answers and names. After some reluctance, the staff revealed that Ruby had been sold at a local auction house less than 2 weeks ago. The winning bid? A measly $800. To add insult to injury, the proceeds hadn't gone to Mark. They'd been deposited directly into the HOA fund, supposedly to cover administrative costs related to the sale. Mark stared at the paperwork in disbelief. $800. That was all his prized motorcycle, a $6,000 masterpiece, had fetched. The injustice of it burned hotter than ever. Not only had Karen stolen something invaluable from him, but she had also reduced Ruby to a fraction of her worth, treating her like little more than junk. That evening, Mark sat alone in his living room, staring blankly at the empty space where Ruby used to sit. Memories flooded his mind. Late nights spent sanding rust off the frame, weekends hunting down rare parts online, the triumphant moment when he finally fired up the engine for the first time. Every detail of Ruby's restoration had been infused with love and care. Now, all of that effort had been erased in an instant, thanks to Karen's reckless actions. Feeling defeated yet unwilling to give up, Mark decided to dig deeper. He contacted the auction house, hoping to retrieve information about the buyer. Unfortunately, privacy laws prevented them from disclosing any personal details. All they could tell him was that the winning bidder had paid cash and taken immediate possession of the motorcycle. With no leads and no way to recover Ruby, Mark felt trapped between rage and despair. He replayed the events over and over in his head, searching for answers, or at least some semblance of justice. Had Karen acted within her rights? Was there anything he could have done differently to prevent this nightmare? Then, inspiration struck. Mark remembered hearing stories about others who had fought back against unfair HOA practices. If Karen believed she could trample over his rights without consequence, she was sorely mistaken. There had to be legal avenues available to hold her accountable. Determined to fight for what was right, Mark picked up his phone and dialed a lawyer specializing in property disputes. The attorney listened intently as Mark recounted the entire ordeal, from the initial violation notice to the shocking discovery of Ruby's sale. By the time Mark finished, the lawyer nodded knowingly. "This is a textbook case of abuse of power," he explained. "Under state law, private property cannot be confiscated or sold without proper due process. Even if Karen claims she acted according to the rules, those rules don't supersede your constitutional rights." For the first time since losing Ruby, Mark felt a flicker of hope. The lawyer assured him that they had a strong case, not just for recovering damages but also for exposing Karen's misconduct. They would file a lawsuit against both Karen and the HOA board, demanding accountability for their actions. As Mark left the lawyer's office, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Yes, Ruby was gone, and the pain of losing her lingered deeply. But this wasn't just about revenge or compensation anymore. It was about standing up for himself and for anyone else who might fall victim to Karen's tyranny. She may have thought she held all the power, but Mark was ready to prove her wrong. Little did Karen know, her reckless decision to sell Ruby had set off a chain reaction, one that would soon land her in hot water. And while Mark couldn't change the past, he vowed to ensure that no one else in Willow Creek Estates would suffer the same fate. Justice might take time, but it was coming, and, when it arrived, Karen would regret every step she'd taken to destroy his beloved motorcycle. Mark's decision to fight back against Karen and the HOA marked a turning point in his life. For weeks he had been consumed by anger and sadness, unable to shake the image of Ruby sitting empty in his driveway, or worse, being hauled away to an auction house. But now, with a lawyer by his side, he felt a glimmer of hope. The lawsuit wasn't just about reclaiming what was rightfully his. It was about holding Karen accountable for her actions and ensuring that no one else in Willow Creek Estates would face similar injustice. The first step was gathering evidence. Mark spent hours poring over documents, the original violation notice, photos of Ruby before she was towed, receipts detailing the thousands of dollars he'd invested in restoring her, and even emails from neighbors expressing sympathy for his situation. He also dug into the HOA's bylaws, searching for any loopholes or contradictions that could strengthen his case. One thing became abundantly clear. The HOA rules were vague at best, leaving plenty of room for interpretation. Nowhere did they explicitly state that private property could be confiscated and sold without proper notice or due process. With the help of his lawyer, Mark crafted a compelling argument. They pointed out that while the HOA technically governed communal spaces like parks and sidewalks, it had no legal authority over personal belongings stored on private driveways. Furthermore, Karen's decision to bypass standard procedures, such as providing adequate warning or allowing Mark to appeal the ruling, was a blatant violation of his rights. The fact that the proceeds from Ruby's sale went straight into the HOA fund only added fuel to the fire, suggesting ulterior motives behind Karen's actions. Word of the lawsuit spread quickly through Willow Creek Estates. At first, residents were hesitant to comment publicly, fearing retaliation from Karen or the HOA board. But as more details emerged, whispers turned into murmurs of support. Many neighbors admitted they'd grown tired of Karen's tyrannical behavior, which often bordered on harassment. Some shared their own stories of run-ins with her, from receiving nitpicky violation notices for minor infractions to being subjected to public shaming during HOA meetings. Others expressed admiration for Mark's courage, praising him for standing up to someone who had long intimidated them into silence. One neighbor, a retired teacher named Mrs. Patel, approached Mark after hearing about the lawsuit. "You're doing the right thing," she said warmly, patting his shoulder. "Karen thinks she can control everyone, but this will show her she's not above the law." Another resident, a young father named Tom, offered to testify on Mark's behalf. "She threatened to fine me $500 because my son left his bike on the sidewalk for 5 minutes," Tom explained. "If you need witnesses, I'm with you." Encouraged by the growing support, Mark began attending neighborhood gatherings, sharing his story and encouraging others to speak out. Slowly but surely, people started opening up about their frustrations with Karen and the HOA. What had once seemed like isolated incidents of bullying now revealed a pattern of abuse, and residents were ready to take a stand. Meanwhile, Karen remained oblivious to the storm brewing around her. Confident in her authority, she continued enforcing petty rules with unwavering zeal. She sent letters to homeowners reminding them to trim their hedges, inspected mailboxes for chipped paint, and even scolded a teenager for skateboarding near a cul-de-sac. To her, these tasks weren't trivial. They were essential to maintaining the prestige of Willow Creek Estates. But behind closed doors, cracks began to form in her carefully constructed facade. Rumors circulated that several members of the HOA board were questioning Karen's leadership. While they hadn't opposed her outright during previous meetings, the backlash from Mark's lawsuit forced them to reconsider their stance. One member confided to another that Karen's actions had gone too far this time. "We can't keep letting her make decisions like this," he whispered. It's bad for the community and bad for our reputation. As preparations for the trial intensified, Mark found himself reflecting on the journey so far. Filing a lawsuit hadn't been an easy decision. It meant confronting Karen head-on, risking further conflict, and exposing himself to scrutiny from both supporters and critics alike. There were moments when doubt crept in, especially late at night when he pictured Ruby sitting somewhere unknown, stripped of the care and attention she deserved. Yet every time he thought about backing down, he remembered why he started this fight in the first place, not just for himself but for justice. His lawyer reminded him repeatedly that lawsuits like this could drag on for months, if not years. But Mark refused to let impatience get the better of him. He knew that winning the case wouldn't magically bring Ruby back, nor would it erase the pain of losing her. Still, it represented something bigger, a chance to hold powerful figures accountable and inspire change within the community. The day finally arrived when Mark received confirmation that the court date had been set. Standing outside his home, he stared at the empty driveway where Ruby used to sit and took a deep breath. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about proving that fairness mattered, that rules existed to serve people rather than oppress them. And though the road ahead promised challenges, Mark felt ready to face whatever came next. For Karen, however, the battle was only beginning. Unaware of the mounting evidence against her, or perhaps too arrogant to care, she remained convinced that her actions were justified. In her mind, she was simply upholding the standards of Willow Creek Estates, protecting its pristine appearance from anything that might tarnish it. But as the trial loomed closer, cracks in her confidence began to show. Neighbors avoided eye contact when she walked by, and fewer people attended HOA meetings. Even her closest allies seemed hesitant to defend her. Little did Karen know, her reign of control was about to crumble, and the courtroom would become the stage where accountability finally caught up to her. For Mark, the upcoming trial symbolized more than just a legal victory. It was a chance to reclaim his dignity, restore balance to his neighborhood, and send a message loud and clear. No one, not even the most powerful figure in Willow Creek Estates, was above the law. Months of preparation led to the day of the trial, and tension hung thick in the air as Mark arrived at the courthouse. Dressed in a crisp navy blue suit that his lawyer had insisted made him look professional yet approachable, Mark felt a mix of nerves and determination. Outside the courtroom, neighbors gathered in small clusters, whispering quietly among themselves. Some offered words of encouragement as he passed by, while others simply nodded in solidarity. It was clear that this case wasn't just about one man's stolen motorcycle anymore. It had become a symbol of resistance against Karen's overreach. Inside, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The courtroom buzzed with activity as attorneys shuffled papers, clerks typed furiously on keyboards, and spectators took their seats. At the center of it all sat Karen Miller, looking every bit the part of someone who believed herself untouchable. She wore oversized designer sunglasses perched atop her head like a crown, paired with an expensive blazer that screamed authority. Her posture was rigid, her expression smug, as though she already knew the outcome of the trial. When the judge entered and called the court to order, silence fell instantly. The proceedings began with opening statements, and Mark's lawyer wasted no time laying out their case. He painted a vivid picture of Ruby, not just as a vintage motorcycle, but as a cherished possession imbued with years of hard work, passion, and memories. This isn't just about property damage or financial loss, the lawyer argued passionately. It's about accountability. My client followed the HOA guidelines to the best of his ability. Yet Mrs. Miller chose to ignore due process and confiscate something irreplaceable without proper justification. Karen's attorney countered by emphasizing the importance of maintaining community standards. The HOA exists to ensure uniformity and aesthetic harmony within Willow Creek Estates, he declared confidently. Mrs. Miller acted within her rights as interim president to enforce those standards. If exceptions are made for one resident, chaos will ensue. As the morning wore on, testimony after testimony unfolded. Mark took the stand first, recounting the emotional significance of Ruby and describing the painstaking effort it took to restore her. His voice cracked slightly when he talked about finding the empty driveway and realizing what Karen had done. Ruby wasn't just a motorcycle, he said, glancing briefly at Karen before turning back to the judge. She represented freedom, creativity, and countless hours of dedication. To see her treated so carelessly, it broke my heart. Next, several neighbors stepped forward to share their experiences with Karen. Mrs. Patel recounted how Karen had once demanded she repaint her mailbox because the shade of blue didn't match the rest of the street. Tom described being fined for letting his son ride a scooter near a cul-de-sac. Each story added weight to the argument that Karen's behavior went beyond enforcing rules. It bordered on harassment. One particularly damning moment came when a former HOA board member admitted under oath that Karen often dismissed dissenting opinions during meetings, insisting her interpretation of the rules was final. Karen finally took the stand, her demeanor shifting from confident to defensive almost immediately. Under questioning, cracks began to show in her carefully constructed narrative. When asked why she hadn't provided Mark with adequate notice before selling Ruby, she stammered, claiming she assumed he'd received the violation letter weeks earlier, pressed further about whether she sought approval from the full HOA board before authorizing the sale. She hesitated, eventually admitting she'd acted alone. Things grew more heated when Mark's lawyer presented photographic evidence showing Ruby covered and stored neatly in the driveway, clearly posing no eyesore. "Does this look like something that violates community standards?" he asked, holding up a blown-up image for the judge to examine. Karen squirmed in her seat, unable to offer a convincing rebuttal. Instead, she doubled down on her reliance on the HOA handbook, repeatedly citing Section 4.2 as if reciting scripture. At one point, the judge interrupted her mid-testimony. "Mrs. Miller," he said sternly, leaning forward slightly, "these guidelines you keep referencing, are they legally binding, or are they merely suggestions meant to guide residents?" Caught off guard, Karen fumbled for an answer. "Well, they're binding, Your Honor," she replied uncertainly. "They exist to maintain order." "And do these guidelines give you the authority to seize private property without following proper legal procedures?" the judge pressed. Karen opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. For the first time since the trial began, her confidence faltered. She glanced toward her attorney, who gave her a subtle shake of the head, a silent signal not to dig herself deeper into trouble. Throughout the day, the courtroom drama unfolded like scenes from a movie. Spectators exchanged knowing glances as Karen struggled to defend her actions, while Mark remained composed, answering questions calmly and respectfully. Even the bailiff couldn't hide a smirk when Karen accidentally referred to Ruby as just a bike during cross-examination, prompting murmurs of disapproval from the gallery. By the time closing arguments rolled around, the tide had clearly turned. Mark's lawyer delivered a powerful summary, reminding the judge that the HOA's role was to govern shared spaces, not dictate what residents could or couldn't store on their own property. "What we have here is a blatant abuse of power," he concluded. "Mrs. Miller prioritized control over compassion, violating both my client's rights and common decency." Karen's attorney tried to salvage the situation, reiterating the need for strict adherence to community guidelines. But his words rang hollow compared to the mountain of evidence stacked against them. As the judge excused himself to deliberate, the room erupted into quiet speculation. Neighbors leaned close to one another, whispering predictions about the verdict. Mark sat quietly beside his lawyer, clutching a photo of Ruby in his hands, feeling cautiously optimistic. For Karen, however, the writing was on the wall. Gone was the air of invincibility she'd carried into the courtroom that morning. In its place was a woman visibly shaken, her face flushed and her fingers drumming nervously on the table. Whether she realized it or not, the trial had exposed not only her misuse of power but also the deep resentment she'd inspired among her peers. What started as a dispute over a motorcycle had spiraled into something far greater, a reckoning for someone who thought she was above reproach. As the judge prepared to deliver his decision, everyone held their breath. Mark knew the verdict wouldn't undo the pain of losing Ruby, nor would it magically restore the peace he'd once known in Willow Creek Estates. But whatever the outcome, one thing was certain: justice had been pursued, and the truth had finally come to light. And, for now, that was enough.